A massive explosion just ripped through the hull, the keel is shattered, and the engine room is rapidly vanishing under seawater. In 1988, the USS Samuel B was seconds away from snapping in half after hitting an Iranian mine. How did this crew defy the laws of physics to keep a sinking tomb afloat? Welcome to the Survival Bunker, where we study the brutal reality of surviving war zones, sieges, and battlefield collapse. Today we are not analyzing infantry, bunkers, or urban combat. We are going beneath the waterline, into the flooding hull of a US Navy frigate that absorbed a mine blast powerful enough to break its own keel and somehow did not sink. This is the story of the USS Samuel B. April 14, 1988, and the fusion of Cold War engineering and raw human endurance that cheated catastrophe. By 1988, the Persian Gulf had become one of the most dangerous maritime corridors on Earth. The Iran-Iraq War, which had raged since 1980, produced a brutal side conflict historians call the Tanker War, a sustained campaign by both sides to strangle each other's oil exports by targeting commercial shipping. Iran's weapon of choice in this campaign was the naval contact mine. Specifically, Iranian forces deployed Soviet-designed M08 moored contact mines, a weapon whose core design dated back to the First World War. These devices were tethered below the surface at a depth calculated to strike a ship's hull at or below the waterline. Visually, they were nearly invisible, low-profile steel spheres, darkened by corrosion, riding just beneath the chop of Gulf waters. The mechanical logic of an underhull explosion is precise and merciless. When a vessel strikes a contact mine, the detonation does not simply punch a hole in steel. The explosion generates a pressure wave and gas bubble that expands and collapses in milliseconds. That bubble acts like a hammer blow against the ship's keel, the structural spine running the full length of the hull. Ships are engineered to resist forces applied from the sides. A vertical pressure wave from below targets their most vulnerable axis. On April 14, 1988, the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate USS Samuel B. FFG 58 was transiting a supposedly cleared lane in the central Persian Gulf, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers under Operation Earnest Will. The crew had no warning. At 16:15 local time, the ship struck a mine. The explosion sent a 250-foot column of water into the air. Sailors on deck were thrown off their feet. Below the waterline, the blast buckled the ship's keel and cracked the hull in 3 separate locations. The main engine room, the mechanical heart of the ship, flooded within seconds, plunging the engineering spaces into darkness. The physics here are honestly worth examining closely. A Perry-class frigate displaces approximately 4,100 tons fully loaded. When the keel cracked, the ship effectively became 2 partially connected sections of steel flexing against each other in open water. The hull was no longer a rigid structure. Every wave that hit the Roberts bent those 2 sections in opposition. Under sustained stress, the vessel faced a phenomenon naval architects call progressive structural failure, where each flex weakens the joint further until the ship breaks apart. The Roberts had been at sea for months. She was not in a shipyard with cranes and dry dock infrastructure. She was in the middle of the Persian Gulf, taking on water, bending in the swell, with a crew of 200 sailors now fighting for her life. What saved the Roberts was not luck. It was decades of Cold War naval engineering doctrine applied before she ever left the shipyard. The Oliver Hazard Perry class was designed with one specific nightmare scenario in mind: surviving Soviet anti-ship missile saturation attacks in the North Atlantic. That threat shaped every structural decision. The hull was divided into multiple watertight compartments, separated by reinforced bulkheads. internal walls engineered to hold back flooding independently of each other. The logic was clear. If one compartment floods, the bulkheads confine the water and the ship stays afloat long enough to fight or withdraw. This compartmentalization was the Roberts' lifeline on April 14th. The flooding in the engine room did not immediately cascade through the ship because the damage control teams had trained to isolate flooded spaces within minutes of a casualty. Watertight doors were secured. Pumps were activated manually where electrical systems had failed. The ship's designers had also ensured redundant electrical generation, backup power systems that could be brought online, even with the main engine room lost. There is a critical detail in the ship's survival that rarely appears in popular accounts. Her gas turbine engines, mounted separately from the main propulsion plant, survived the initial blast. This gave the crew an emergency propulsion option, a decision to separate systems that, under other circumstances, might have looked like over-engineering. Engineering creates the conditions for survival. Sailors execute it. Within minutes of the blast, damage control teams were moving through smoke-filled passageways, carrying shoring timber, hydraulic jacks, and cable. The crew performed what naval engineers now describe as triage engineering under fire, improvisational structural repair in an active casualty environment with no external support. The most documented and remarkable intervention was the use of wire cables rigged across the fracture point in the hull. The crew literally stitched the ship together. Cables were tensioned across the cracked keel section to prevent the two halves of the hull from flexing apart any further. This is not a procedure pulled from a manual. It was a field solution developed in real time by men who understood the physics of what was happening to their ship and had the training to improvise. Simultaneously, other teams were manually shoring buckled bulkheads, wedging timber beams against deformed steel walls to prevent them from collapsing under water pressure. Emergency lighting was restored. Pumps were manned around the clock in rotation. The Roberts was kept afloat for nearly 12 hours through human effort alone before a salvage team arrived. She was eventually towed to Dubai and then transported back to the United States aboard a heavy-lift vessel for repairs. No crew members died, a fact that becomes extraordinary when you examine the scale of the structural damage. The USS Samuel B. Roberts incident did not pass unexamined. It became a case study in naval survivability doctrine that shaped how the US Navy approached ship design and crew training in the decades that followed. The immediate military response was Operation Praying Mantis, launched on April 18, 1988, 4 days after the Roberts was mined. US forces destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms used as military staging areas and sank or damaged several Iranian naval vessels in the largest US surface engagement since the Second World War. The Roberts had consequences beyond her own hull. In terms of structural doctrine, the incident reinforced 2 design imperatives that remain central to US naval engineering in 2026: redundant compartmentalization and the separation of critical systems so that no single point of failure can disable an entire vessel. These principles directly influenced the survivability specifications for modern littoral combat ships and the DDG-1000 Zumwalt-class destroyers. Mine countermeasures received renewed institutional attention. The Navy had assumed cleared corridors were safe, but the Roberts proved that assumption lethal. Post-1988 doctrine invested heavily in dedicated mine-hunting vessels, forward-deployed MCM groups, and updated detection protocols that, remain active today in the Strait of Hormuz, the same choke point where that minefield was laid. The enduring lesson is not complicated. Resilience is a system, not an accident. It requires engineers who design for catastrophic failure, commanders who train crews to act without instruction, and sailors who know their ship well enough to improvise under fire. The Roberts survived because all 3 elements were present simultaneously. The USS Samuel B did not survive that minefield because of a single decision. She survived because of 1,000 decisions made years before that explosion, in shipyards, in training manuals, in damage control drills run at 0300 on calm days when sinking felt like an abstraction. That is the lesson every student of military survival carries forward. Preparation is not a reaction, it is architecture. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of how men and machines survive the unsurvivable, subscribe to the Survival Bunker and share this video with anyone who takes history and preparedness seriously. Every share puts this channel in front of someone who needs it. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a briefing. We will see you in the next one.